The great chamber of the Galactic Council stretched upward like the inside of a massive cathedral. Its walls carved from living crystal that pulsed with soft blue light, and every surface seemed designed to make visitors feel small and insignificant. 12 species had built this place over 10,000 years, and they had built it to intimidate. Ambassador Elena Vasquez stood on the obsidian floor at the center of the chamber, feeling the weight of 1,000 alien eyes upon her, and she kept her spine straight and her face calm even though her heart was pounding in her chest. Behind her stood only 3 aides, the entire human diplomatic presence among the stars, and they looked like children standing before giants. The council members sat in elevated positions around the chamber, each species in its designated section, and they looked down at the humans with expressions ranging from boredom to open contempt. High Arbiter Velthax of the Dominion rose from his throne, his ancient face creased with the weight of centuries, and when he spoke, his voice echoed through the chamber like thunder rolling across mountains. The Galactic Council has reached its decision regarding the human species, he announced, and every word dripped with the certainty of absolute power. You have expanded beyond your original boundaries. Without permission, you have established colonies in restricted sectors, and you have failed to pay proper tribute to the elder races who have guided this galaxy for millennia. Elena listened without changing her expression, though inside she felt a cold fury building. The charges were lies. Of course, humanity had done nothing wrong except exist and grow, and refused to grovel before species who saw themselves as gods. The Council offers you one chance to avoid annihilation, Velthax continued, and his thin lips curved into something that might have been a smile. Surrender your colonies beyond the Sol system, dismantle your military fleets, and accept your proper status as a client species under the protection and guidance of the Dominion. A murmur of approval rippled through the chamber, and several delegates made gestures that Elena had learned to recognize as laughter. You have 72 standard hours to accept these terms, Velthax concluded, and he sat back down with the satisfaction of someone who had already won. Fail to comply, and the combined Council Armada will reduce your civilization to ash and memory. Elena stood in silence for a long moment, letting the threat hang in the air, and then she smiled. It was a thin smile, tied around the edges, but it held something that made several of the nearby delegates shift uncomfortably in their seats. We need to consult with Earth, she said, and her voice was quiet, but somehow it carried to every corner of the vast chamber. You will have our answer in 72 hours. She turned and walked out of the chamber without waiting for permission, and her 3 aides followed her with their heads held. The council members watched them go with amusement dancing in their eyes. The Velkari delegate's tendrils rippled with what passed for laughter among his kind, and he leaned toward his neighbor from the Dominion. They still think they have a choice, he whispered, and they both made sounds of entertainment. The humans were nothing. After all, they had barely mastered faster than light travel 2 centuries ago, and their territory was a pitiful smear of 43 systems in the galactic backwater, where no one important ever went. Their combined military could not match a single Dominion battle group, and everyone knew it. Consultation was merely a formality before the inevitable submission that always came. Every young species eventually learned its place on the human diplomatic vessel racing back toward Earth. Elena Vasquez stood alone in her quarters and stared out at the stars streaming past. Her hands were shaking, but not with fear. She was angry in a way she had never been angry before, and she knew that her people would feel the same when they heard what the Council demanded. Humanity had not crawled out of the caves and survived ice ages and plagues and wars, just to kneel before aliens who thought age gave them the right to rule. She opened a communication channel to Earth and began transmitting everything that had happened, and she knew that her message would reach every human colony within hours. The decision would not be hers alone. It would belong to all of humanity. 72 hours passed like a held breath. And when Elena Vasquez returned to the council chamber, she carried only a single datapad in her hands. The chamber was fuller than before, with observers from dozens of minor species crowding the galleries to watch what everyone assumed would be a humiliating surrender. High Arbiter Velthax looked down at her with patient condescension. Like a teacher waiting for a slow student to admit defeat, Ambassador Vasquez, he said. And his voice was almost gentle. We trust you have brought the council's terms back to your people and explained their situation clearly. I have, Elena replied. And she walked to the speaker's pedestal at the center of the floor. The people of Earth and all human territories have voted on your ultimatum. A ripple of surprise moved through the chamber. Voted. What kind of primitive species put matters of survival to a vote? The vote was conducted across every colony, every station, every ship, Elena continued. And her voice grew stronger with each word. 11.4 billion humans participated in the decision, and the results have been certified by every government in human space. High Arbiter Velthax leaned forward, his ancient eyes narrowing with something that might have been the first hint of uncertainty. And your answer, Ambassador? Elena looked around the chamber, meeting the eyes of every species that had condemned her people. And when she spoke, her voice rang out like a bell. 94% voted in favor of war. The silence that followed was absolute. No one moved. No one breathed, and for a moment the entire chamber seemed frozen in time. You choose extinction? Velthax finally asked, and for the first time his voice held something other than confidence. Lina shook her head slowly, and when she smiled this time, there was nothing tired about it. No. High Arbiter, we choose to fight, and there is a difference between those two things. A difference that your council has apparently forgotten. She placed the datapad on the speaker's pedestal with a sharp click that echoed through the stunned silence. This is a formal declaration of war against the Galactic Council and all affiliated species. Effective immediately, signed by every government in human space, and ratified by the will of our people. She turned to leave, then paused and looked back over her shoulder. You gave us 72 hours to decide our fate. So let me give you some advice in return. Her eyes were hard as diamonds and bright as stars. Start counting your ships. High Arbiter, because you are going to need every single one of them. She walked out of the chamber. And this time no one was laughing. In the weeks following the human declaration of war, the Galactic Council moved with the calm efficiency of predators who had never known defeat. Fleet Admiral Kethoris stood on the observation deck of his flagship, the Eternal Dominion, and watched as the greatest military force assembled in 3 centuries took shape before his eyes. 12,000 capital ships hung in formation around the staging point, each one bristling with weapons that could crack planets and shields that could shrug off nuclear fire. 90,000 support vessels filled the spaces between them, carrying troops and supplies and enough firepower to burn 100 worlds. The crews numbered in the hundreds of millions, drawn from 8 species with combat experience spanning thousands of years. And every single one of them knew that this war would be over before it truly began. High Arbiter Velthax had come to witness the departure. His ancient form carried on a floating platform that hummed with power, and he addressed the assembled commanders with words designed to echo through history. Today, we remind the galaxy why the Council rules, he declared, and his voice was broadcast to every ship in the Armada. The humans have chosen defiance, and defiance must be punished. Because if one young species believes it can challenge us, then others will follow. And the order we have built over 10,000 years will crumble into chaos. He raised one withered hand in a gesture of benediction. Go forth and teach them the price of arrogance. And when you return, we will speak of humanity the way we speak of all the others who dared to rise above their station. He meant as a warning, As a cautionary tale told to young species who dreamed too big, Admiral Cathoras bowed his head in acknowledgement. And when he gave the order to advance, the entire armada moved as one. A wall of ships so vast it blotted out the stars behind it. They traveled through fold space and jumps that covered light years in moments. And with each jump, they grew closer to human territory and the easy victory that awaited them. The first human system they entered was called New Singapore, a colony of 60 million souls built around a temperate world with blue oceans and green continents. Cathoras expected to find orbital defenses, perhaps a small fleet making a futile stand. Certainly something worth destroying. What he found was nothing. The orbital stations hung dark and empty, their lights extinguished and their docking bays abandoned. The colony on the planet below showed no signs of life. No electromagnetic emissions, no response to hails. His scouts descended to the surface and found cities standing silent. Streets empty of movement, buildings cleared of everything valuable. The humans had evacuated, taking everything they could carry and leaving nothing behind but empty shells. Cowards, his tactical officer sneered. And similar sentiments echoed across the fleet. They are running, another commander declared with contempt, concentrating their forces for a pathetic last stand at their homeworld. Cathoras said nothing, but a cold feeling had begun to grow in his secondary heart. He had commanded fleets for 200 years, and he had seen what retreat looked like. This was something different. The second system was the same, empty and dark, and so was the third and the fourth. And every human world they reached, 80 million people had vanished from these colonies, disappearing like smoke in the wind. And not a single ship rose to challenge the Council's advance. Cathoras began to receive troubling reports from his intelligence officers. Strange energy signatures flickered at the edge of their sensor range, appearing and disappearing too quickly to track. Communication bursts rippled through space using encryption so complex that the Council's finest analysts could not even begin to crack it. Supply ships bringing reinforcements and ammunition to the fleet began to vanish without distress calls. There one moment and gone the next, leaving nothing but empty space where they had been predators. Cathoras muttered to himself as he studied the tactical displays. They are hunting like predators. His tactical officer looked up with confusion. Admiral, they are prey. Everyone knows they are prey. Young and weak and foolish. Cathoras shook his head slowly. We know nothing about them. Commander, we assumed they were prey because they were young. But age is not the only measure of a species. And we may have made a terrible mistake. He stared out at the star field ahead. And for the first time in centuries, he felt something he had almost forgotten. Fear. The humans were not running. They were watching, they were learning, they were waiting. And somewhere out there in the darkness between stars, they were preparing something that the Council could not imagine. Cathoras ordered his fleet to proceed with increased caution, sending scouts ahead and keeping his formations tight. But it made no difference because the humans remained invisible. Every system was empty, every world abandoned. And the silence pressed down on the armada like a physical weight. Crews that had been confident began to grow nervous, jumping at shadows on their sensors. And discipline that had been iron hard started to fray around the edges. Some of the younger officers suggested turning back, regrouping, waiting for more information. But Cathoras knew that was impossible. The Council had declared this war would be quick and decisive, and returning home without victory would be an admission of weakness that none of them could afford. So they pressed forward, deeper into human territory, following a path that led toward a system called Tau Ceti, where intelligence suggested the humans were finally gathering. Cathoras studied everything his scouts could tell him about Tau Ceti, and found nothing remarkable. A yellow star, several rocky planets, one of them colonized by humans about a century ago. Nothing that could stop 12,000 capital ships. Nothing that could challenge the greatest armada ever assembled. But as his fleet made the final jump into the Tau Ceti system, Admiral Cathoras could not shake the feeling that he was not the hunter in this war. He was the hunted, and the trap was about to close. While the Council Armada pushed deeper into empty space, hunting for an enemy that refused to appear, humanity worked on Earth, in the great industrial zones that stretched across continents. Factories that had not operated in generations roared back to life forges that had been cold for a century, now burned with fires hot enough to melt starship armor. And assembly lines that had been silent began to move with a rhythm that never stopped, day or night. Week after week, every asteroid mining operation in the solar system shifted from resource extraction to weapons manufacturing. And ore that would have become building materials now became missiles and railgun ammunition, and the hulls of warships. Every university, every research institute, every private laboratory in human space pivoted to a single purpose with a coordination that should have been impossible, but humans had always been good at coming together when something threatened to destroy them. General Sarah Chun stood in the command center buried deep beneath the Martian surface, surrounded by holographic displays that showed data streams from across all of human civilization around her. Thousands of officers coordinated the largest mobilization in human history, their voices calm and professional despite the weight of what they were attempting. Production status, she asked, and her voice carried the authority of someone who had spent 40 years preparing for a war she hoped would never come. Colonel James Okonkwo checked his displays and allowed himself a small smile. Shipyards are exceeding targets by 30%, General. The new drone carriers are rolling out at 16 per day, and railgun ammunition stockpiles are now sufficient for 18 months of sustained engagement. General Chun nodded and moved to the next critical question. Project Prometheus? A brief pause, and then Okonkwo's smile grew wider. First deployment ready in 72 hours. Second and third units completing final assembly. We will have all 5 operational within the month. Chun allowed herself a moment of satisfaction before returning to the endless work of preparation. The council thought they were fighting a conventional war against a young and foolish species. They had no idea what they were truly facing. This was humanity's secret, the one thing the council's anthropologists had missed in their cursory assessments of the human race. They had looked at a species that had only been spacefaring for 2 centuries and seen nothing worth fearing. They had measured human military strength and found it laughably inadequate. What they had not thought to measure was the depth of human creativity, the terrifying speed of human adaptation, and the simple, stubborn refusal to accept defeat that ran through human blood like fire in 200 years of spacefaring civilization. Humans had produced more scientific papers than the Dominion had published in 10,000 years. Their patent databases contained more innovations than all the elder races combined. They had revolutionized fields that the council considered long settled, finding efficiencies in technologies that the elder races had dismissed as already optimized, and they had done all of this while being ignored and dismissed and treated as barely worth noticing. Elder races had grown comfortable in their power and their certainty. They had not needed to innovate for millennia because no one challenged them. They fought wars with the same tactics and the same weapons they had used for thousands of years, because those tactics and weapons had always been enough. Humanity had no such luxury. Humans had spent their entire existence fighting for survival against predators and plagues and disasters and each other. They had climbed out of caves and spread across a hostile world through sheer determination and cleverness, they had survived ice ages that should have frozen them and famines that should have starved them and wars that should have destroyed them, and through it all, they had never stopped imagining what might come next, what threat might appear over the horizon, what enemy might someday arrive from the stars. Human fiction was filled with alien invasions, with extinction-level threats, with civilizations facing annihilation, and every time humans imagined such scenarios, they also imagined how to survive them. They wrote stories about desperate last stands and unlikely victories, and the triumph of will over impossible odds. Then they went to their laboratories and their factories and their military academies, and they built the weapons to make those stories real. The council had never asked themselves what they would do if a superior force arrived and demanded their submission. They had always been the superior force. Humanity had been asking that question for centuries, and they had been preparing their answer just as long. General Chun looked at the strategic display showing the council armadas advance through human space, watching them push deeper and deeper into the trap that had been carefully prepared for them. "They think we are running," she said quietly, and there was something almost like pity in her voice. Colonel Okonkwo nodded. "Their arrogance blinds them, General. They cannot imagine that prey might become predator." Chun shook her head slowly. "We were never prey, Colonel. We were simply waiting for them to show us who they truly were. And now that they have threatened our children and our future and everything we have built, there is nothing we will not do to survive." She turned to face her staff, and her eyes were hard as the hull of a warship. "All units, all systems, all forces, execute Operation Prometheus. Let us show the Council what happens when humanity decides to fight across human space." Hidden assets that had been dormant for weeks began to stir in asteroid belts and around gas giants, behind moons and inside hollowed-out comets. Ships that had been running silent and cold-powered, up their engines, weapons platforms that had drifted through space disguised as debris, armed their missiles, and pointed their railguns toward the stars. And in the shipyards orbiting a dozen worlds, massive shapes began to move, constructs so large they defied imagination. Engines powerful enough to crack planets, weapons designed to end wars in a single devastating strike project. Prometheus was ready, humanity was ready, and the Council Armada was about to discover that the finale they had been promised would not be humanity's end, it would be their own. Admiral Kethoras finally found the human fleet at the edge of the Tau Ceti system, and for a moment he felt nothing but relief that the chase was finally over. 300 ships hung in formation around the system's inhabited planet, their hulls gleaming in the light of the yellow star, arranged in a defensive pattern that any first-year tactical student could have designed. His tactical officer laughed with contempt when he saw the display. "Pathetic. Admiral, they have gathered everything they have, and it amounts to less than 3% of our force." The bridge crew joined in the laughter, and the tension that had built over weeks of chasing shadows finally began to release. But Kethoras did not laugh. Something about the human formation troubled him in ways he could not quite name. The ships were too organized, their positioning too precise, and they showed none of the frantic energy he expected from a desperate last stand. And those ships themselves were wrong somehow. They did not match any configurations in the Council's extensive databases. Their lines were too sharp and their weapons arrays too large, and they sat in space with the patient stillness of predators waiting to strike. "Hail them," he ordered, and his voice cut through the celebration on the bridge. The view screen flickered to life, and a human woman appeared before him. She wore a crisp military uniform with stars on her collar, and her expression was so calm it bordered on serene. "Admiral Kethoras," she said, and her voice was steady as stone. "I am Fleet Admiral Vasquez of the United Human Forces." and you have entered sovereign human space with hostile intent, the same family name as the ambassador who had declared war. Keth, Aras noted with interest. He wondered if they were related. Fleet Admiral, he replied. And he allowed a touch of respect to enter his voice because courage deserved acknowledgement even from enemies. You have fought well by running and hiding, but the chase is over. Surrender now, and I will ensure your people are treated with dignity in their defeat. Admiral Vasquez did not blink. This is your only opportunity to withdraw. Admiral, take your ships and leave human space, and we will consider the matter settled. Laughter erupted across the bridge again, louder than before. And even Kethoris felt his mouth twist with amusement despite his unease. 300 ships telling 12,000 to retreat? It was absurd. You have courage, he told the human. And he meant it. But courage alone cannot stop 12,000 capital ships. And your brave words will not save your people from what comes next. Admiral Vasquez's expression did not change by even a fraction. You are right. Admiral, courage alone is not enough. She paused, and something shifted in her eyes, something that made Kethora's secondary hearts beat faster. That is why we brought something else. The first warning came from the sensor officers, their voices rising with sudden alarm as their displays exploded with new data energy readings were spiking across the entire system. Massive signatures appearing everywhere at once. And none of them came from the human fleet. They came from the asteroid belt. They came from the outer planets. They came from the empty space itself. Admiral, his tactical officer shouted. All trace of laughter gone from his voice. I am detecting unknown contacts, hundreds of them. No, thousands. They are appearing everywhere. Kethoris stared at his display and felt the blood drain from his face. What he had assumed were distant stars began to move, resolving into drive signatures that stretched across the system like a closing fist drone carriers that had hidden among the asteroids for weeks, were deploying hundreds of autonomous combat units each, filling the space around the Council Armada with a swarm of deadly machines missile. Platforms that had drifted silent and cold, disguised as debris, were awakening now. Their targeting systems locking onto Council ships with hungry precision stealth. Vessels that had followed the Armada since it first entered human space were decloaking in perfect attack positions. Their weapons already charged and ready, and something else was emerging from behind Tau Ceti's largest gas giant. Something so massive that the sensors could not properly comprehend. Its size. Kethoris watched the shape grow larger and larger on his display, and he felt his mind struggle to accept. What he was seeing, it was bigger than any space station he had ever seen. It was bigger than any orbital construct. In Council space it dwarfed even the largest Dominion dreadnoughts the way those dreadnoughts dwarf fighters. What is that? His tactical officer whispered, and his voice cracked with terror. Admiral Vasquez answered through the still open channel, and her calm had become something terrible. We call it Prometheus. Admiral, it is a planet cracker, designed and built in just 8 months. She paused, and when she spoke again, her voice held the weight of all humanity's fury. An admiral, it is not the only one. The trap closed human ships attacked in patterns the Council tactical doctrine had never imagined. Their formations fluid and unpredictable, controlled by networked artificial intelligences that processed data faster than any organic mind could follow. Their weapons employed principles that Council scientists had dismissed as purely theoretical. Directed energy beams that tore through shields like paper. Quantum tunneling warheads that appeared inside ships and detonated before countermeasures could respond. Railguns that accelerated projectiles to fractions of light speed with devastating effect. Council formations that had held for millennia shattered under the assault ships that had never known defeat found themselves outmaneuvered and outgunned commanders who had won 100 battles suddenly found themselves losing the only battle that mattered. But the most terrifying thing about the human attack was not their weapons or their tactics, it was their willingness to sacrifice drone ships through themselves into council formations without hesitation, detonating in cascades of nuclear fire that ripped through packed warships. Human pilots flew suicide runs against targets 10 times their size, their final transmissions broadcasting not screams of fear but laughter, songs, and defiant curses in 100 Earth languages. They did not fight like a species facing extinction. They fought like a species that had been waiting for this moment for a very long time. In 6 hours, the greatest armada ever assembled ceased to exist as a fighting force of 12,000 capital ships. Fewer than 800 escaped of 90,000 support vessels. Barely 1,000 survived. Admiral Cathors watched his flagship burn around him as the emergency systems failed one by one in his final moments. As the fire consumed everything he had been, he understood had lost a terrible mistake the Council had made. They had looked at humanity and seen prey. They had not understood that humanity had spent its entire existence learning to become the most dangerous predators in the galaxy, and now the hunters had become the hunted. The last thing Admiral Cathors heard before the darkness took him was a human voice broadcasting across all frequencies. "This is Fleet Admiral Vasquez of the United Human Forces. The battle is over. Return to your masters and tell them what happened here today. Tell them that humanity chose war. And tell them that we won." Her voice hardened into steel. "And tell them we are coming." The great chamber of the Galactic Council had been designed to make visitors feel small. Its soaring walls and crystal surfaces meant to remind lesser species of their proper place in the order of things. But the order had changed. General Sarah Chun sat in the High Arbiter's throne, the same seat from which Velthax had once condemned humanity to submission or extinction, and she looked down at the 12 species representatives who now stood on the obsidian floor where Ambassador Vasquez had once stood alone. They were not laughing now. The war had lasted only 3 months after the Battle of Tau Ceti, and those months had been a nightmare for the elder races. Human fleets had struck at supply lines and communication networks with surgical precision, crippling the Council's ability to coordinate their remaining forces. The 5 Prometheus-class planet crackers had positioned themselves above the homeworlds of each major Council species, and their presence had made the choice very simple: surrender or face the destruction of everything you have ever built. One by one, the Council members had chosen to live. Now they stood before humanity's representative, waiting to learn their fate. And the fear in their eyes was something that none of them had ever expected to feel. General Chun let the silence stretch, studying each delegate in turn, reading their expressions and their body language, and the 1,000 small signs that revealed what they truly felt. Some showed terror, convinced that humanity would do to them what they had planned to do to Earth. Others showed rage barely held in check, their pride wounded beyond bearing. But a few showed something else, something that looked almost like hope. And it was to those delegates that Chen addressed her first words. "You believed this war would be our finale," she said. And her voice was quiet, but it carried to every corner of the vast chamber. "You were partially correct in that belief. Because this was indeed an ending, just not the ending you expected." She rose from the throne and walked down the steps to stand among them. And despite being smaller than most of the assembled delegates, she somehow seemed to fill the entire space with her presence. "The Galactic Council as you knew it is finished. The old order that allowed the strong to prey upon the weak is dead. And we stand in the ashes of 10,000 years of tyranny." Former High Arbiter Velthax trembled with rage and humiliation. "You will not be able to hold what you have taken," he snarled. "Other powers will rise against you. The Outer Rim Confederacy and the Machine Collective will never tolerate a species that destroys the established order. You have doomed yourselves to eternal war. General Chun turned to face him, and her expression showed no anger. Only a calm certainty that was somehow more terrifying than fury. We have already made contact with both the Confederacy and the Collective. She replied, they are quite intrigued by us. It seems that the Council's dominance has made very few friends over the millennia, and many are eager to see what a galaxy without the Council might look like. Velthax fell silent, his arguments crumbling before the weight of reality. Chun continued her walk around the circle of delegates. We did not want this war, she told them. We asked for nothing except to be left alone, to grow and explore and find our own path among the stars, to make our own mistakes and learn our own lessons without interference. Her voice grew harder. You chose to threaten us instead, to demand that we surrender our freedom and our future, to bow before species who had done nothing to earn our respect except survive longer than we had. She stopped before a young Velkari delegate who had taken the place of the one killed at Tau Ceti. We are humanity, and let me tell you what that means. The delegate flinched but held his ground. We crawled out of caves on a dangerous world and dared to dream of touching the stars. We survived ice ages that should have frozen us and plagues that should have killed, US and wars that nearly destroyed everything we built. Her eyes blazed with an inner fire. We split the atom and held in our hands the power to end our own species. And we chose not to use it for annihilation. We created art and music and stories that asked what if, and then we went out and made those what ifs real. She turned to address them all. We do not bow. We do not break. We do not forgive easily those who threaten our children and our future. Her voice softened slightly, but we can learn to coexist with those who are willing to see us as equals rather than prey. She walked back to the steps of the throne, but did not climb them. The Galactic Council is dissolved as of this moment. In its place we will build something new, a true federation where every species has a voice regardless of age or power, where the strong protect the weak instead of devouring them, where we face the darkness between the stars together instead of alone. She looked out at the gathered delegates, and her expression held something that might have been compassion. You thought this day would be our finale, the end of the human story before it had barely begun. She smiled. And it was the smile of someone who had seen the worst the galaxy could offer and refused to be broken by it. Instead, this is our introduction. This is the moment when the galaxy learns who we really are. Not conquerors or destroyers, but builders and dreamers and protectors. She raised her voice so that it rang from the crystal walls. Humanity is here now, and we will never again be ignored. We will never again be threatened. And we will never again stand alone on this floor and accept the judgment of those who think age gives them the right to rule. She turned to face the delegates one final time. Join us in building something better. Or stand aside and watch as we build it without you. But know this, the old way is finished. And the new way begins today, 50 years later. The memorial at Tau Ceti drew visitors from across known space. Members of 100 species came to stand before the Wall of Names, the great monument that listed every human who had died in what they now called the Liberation War. Among the visitors walked an elderly Velkari, his tendrils gray with age, moving slowly through the crowds until he stood before a particular section of the wall. A young human woman noticed him standing there, tears flowing from his secondary eyes. And she approached with gentle curiosity. Did you know them? She asked. The old Velkari was silent. For a long moment, I commanded the ship that killed many of them. He finally replied, before they destroyed us in turn. He looked at her with wonder in his ancient eyes. I expected to hate your kind forever after that day. But instead, I find myself grateful beyond words. Grateful. She asked with surprise. Your people could have done to us what we intended for you. he said. Subjugation. Destruction, extinction, you had the power and you had the right. But instead you offered us this. He gestured at the memorial, at the mixed species crowds, at the ships of a dozen civilizations passing peacefully overhead, a chance to be better than we were, a chance to build something worthy of the stars instead of empires built on fear. The young woman smiled, and the old Valkyrie thought it was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. That is what humans do. She said simply, we fight for tomorrow. And then we build it. She offered him her hand in the human gesture of friendship. He took it without hesitation above them. Ships from across the Federation crossed the sky, heading toward the frontier and the endless mysteries waiting to be discovered. And somewhere in the vast darkness between galaxies, other civilizations watched and wondered about the strange, young species that had looked annihilation in the eye and smiled. The day humanity chose war had indeed been a finale, just not the one anyone expected.